we are. We're gonna do another video on Kerry Holzman's channel. My name is Subi Mike. I've been called worse, but today we're gonna do an install on an engine install on a 2006 Subaru Forester. This is a engine that has variable cam timing, so there are a few differences between this install and an install previous to 2006. In 2006, they have moved the catalytic converters. If you want to take a look up here, Harry, they moved the catalytic converters up to the front of the engine compartment. That's previous to that. All the exhaust was actually behind the transmission. It's not really any harder to do. It just looks harder. But once you've done it a little bit, it's not a big deal. So we're getting ready to drop the engine in. It's already dressed out. We got spark plugs in it, motor mounts in it. Most of the essential stuff is on it already, except for the intake and spark plugs and spark plug wires and stuff. So before I drop the engine in, I take a sanding block with some 80 grit sandpaper, and I just sand the tops of the exhaust manifolds. You don't have to have a power tool to do this, just a rubber sanding block and sandpaper, just to make sure there's no rust or anything on this exhaust manifold that would prevent the gasket from sealing. So just clean them off nice. The other thing I like to do is I like to take a round rasp file and I like to just clean the pinholes for the alignment pins. And all I do is go around it and just clean any of the corrosion or debris out of there. I do it on both sides. Make sure you're doing the pinhole and not the bolt hole. And just clean just so your pins slide in nicely. It just takes a minute with a round rasp file. And we're going to look at the back of the engine. These alignment pins are extremely important. There's one on each side. It's a 10 millimeter pin. It's 10 millimeter by 24 millimeter in length. These pins are very important to make sure that the torque converter or the clutch, if you have a manual, are aligned perfectly with the engine. So these alignment pins, they a lot of times will stay in the transmission when you pull the engine. You need to remove them from the transmission and drive them back into the engine and make sure that the pinholes are clean in the transmission before you install the engine. So I've already got the flywheel torqued to 70 foot-pounds, and we've got the pins in here. The flywheel cover on the bottom, we're not going to put that back in. They're just not worth the pain in the butt, and they didn't use them for years on automatic cars, and then suddenly they decided they needed them, but I don't put them back in. They're just really hard to manipulate around the torque converter, so I just don't put them back in. So yeah, we're just getting ready to drop this in. I jacked the transmission up. I put a block of wood. You might be able to see it here, Carrie, if you look. If you look right through there, underneath the transmission filter, you can see a block of wood. It's a 2x4, the width of the pan, and I've lifted the transmission up about 2 inches off the engine cross member. That helps you to get the engine to line up squarely when you go to assemble the two. So you can see the distance right here. It's about 2 to 3 inches. Don't jack it up too high because on these cars you'll actually pull the joint out of the axle. This axle needs to be replaced. Once I get the engine in it, I'll pull that axle out and replace that axle. That boot is completely gone. I'm going to just wheel this over in front of the car, jack it up so it'll clear the front bumper. you'll see that I left the harmonic balancer off of it. I put the harmonic balancer back on the engine when it's in. It just gives you a little extra room in the front of the engine. Some people like to have that on before they put the engine in, but I have the proper tool to tighten them up, so I don't have to worry about using an impact to put it on. So we're just kind of aligning it up. We're going to drop it in slow. Okay, so we're about where it needs to be. Now, the way I've got the chain set up, I've always got to lift up on the front of the motor a little bit to get the alignment pins in place. Some people have levelers that they put on the engine, and I don't use one. Have never really felt the need for it. So I just lift the front of the motor up with my hand and line the pin up in the transmission, the lower bolt. I've got to raise the transmission up just a tad more. Okay, so I got both the bolts lined up. And I've just pushed it in, and it's all pretty much made it up. If you look at the parting line here, the engine and transmission are completely lined up. You should be able to do that with an automatic or manual. If you're putting a engine in with a clutch on it, sometimes you'll have to put the crankshaft bolt in it and spin it just a little bit to get the splines to line up as you push it in. You shouldn't have to use a bolt to draw the two together. You should be able to just made them up like I just did. So after you get that done, I let the jack down. So I'm going to let the weight off the jack, the transmission weight off the jack. And I'm going to install two bell housing bolts, one on each side. And this bolt is right. The one I'm putting in right now is the second one from the bottom, which makes that the third from the top. It's fairly centered with the bell housing, which is why I put that one in first. And I just draw it up with my electric ratchet. And then I'll go to the other side and do the same thing. Hit the same bolt, the same spot. Pulled right in. So now that I've got that made it up good and I know it's not going to come back apart, I drop the weight of the engine into the cradle, and it's set right in. We have the engine set in place, it's dropped down on the cradle, and the motor mount studs should be all lined up perfectly. You can tell that because it's level and I felt it drop, you can tell that it actually seated down into the engine cradle. So we're ready to start putting things together. So I'm taking the chain off the engine. Take the bolts out. I like putting a chain across the two intake bolts, you know, at an angle. That way I can actually tilt the engine the way I want to. I know a lot of people like those engine stabilizers but I think they're too bulky. They get in my way. I just do things my way. I have the exhaust being held up by a jack stand right now at this point. That exhaust, the exhaust is heavy, and I just don't like the weight of it hanging from the hanger because it puts a lot of weight on the rear donut on the back of the catalytic converter setup. So I currently have that supported. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get underneath the car first and put the exhaust bolts on it, and put the motor mount nuts on it too right away. So now I have everything laid out on the ground here. This is everything to put it in. If you look at the nuts, this is an exhaust nut and this is a motor mount nut. You can see they're actually two different sizes. Not only are they two different sizes, but the exhaust nuts are stainless steel and these nuts are mild steel. Lots of people mix them up when they go to put the motor, you know, back in the car. So I always lay these all out and kind of categorize everything before I start to put the engine in. So I always take the two motor mount nuts, and these are the motor mount washers, and I'm going to put those in a pile, and I'm going to take 6 of these nuts, the exhaust nuts, and I'm just going to set them aside, and I'm going to set them on the ground. When I drop the weight of the engine onto the car, it actually bound up the exhaust because that's on a jack stand. So I just got to jack a little bit of the weight off the car to pull a jack stand out so I can put the exhaust on. Just going to jack it up on the frame rail just a little bit. That'll be plenty. A little bit more. I'll go a little bit higher. Okay, so now I can move the exhaust around. So I'm going to put the exhaust gaskets up in place. Slide them over the exhaust studs.
Slow down on this one so I can see where you're going, because I can't see the other side.
Yeah, and you can't, it's really hard to see even for me. I can't even see the exhaust studs from here. It's very difficult to see. It's all by feel. In fact, I'm gonna get my little flashlight. So, I don't know if you can actually see up in there. It's kind of hard to see that exhaust. That's why this particular style exhaust is a little bit harder to work on. You can't really get your hand up in there like you can with the earlier style exhaust. It's very hard to, it takes up a lot of room up front here. And you can't put these exhaust gaskets on prior to dropping the engine in because they'll just fall off. Okay, so both the exhaust gaskets are in place. I'm going to lift this exhaust up quickly before one of them falls out and get at least a nut or two started. That's the hardest part about this install, is getting the exhaust lined out. Of course, it's much easier if you're on a hoist or have the car jacked up. Now this impact is set to 70 foot-pounds. So I just go ahead and draw them right up and tighten them up to 70 foot-pounds. Never broke one yet. Okay, and then put the motor mount nuts on it. And then I'm done underneath. Of course, that's hard to see where those motor mount nuts are, but they're just on the frame cradle right there. Pretty easy to see. Tighten them up. Okay. Double check all the exhaust. Yep, we're all good. So we're done underneath the car. That's it. That's all you have to put on it from underneath. So that's why I don't jack it up and put it on jack stands and get it all lifted up and stuff, because you only have eight nuts to put on. So once the exhaust is bolted up and the motor mount the nuts are on, you're done under there. So now we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna finish bolting the engine and the transmission together. We're going to put all the bell housing bolts and the starter in it. So got them all laid out here. We've already got two in there. So we need a starter bolt and one more bell bolt on this side, and two more bell bolts on this side, and then there's a nut and a washer for the lower studs. There's a stud on the bottom of the bell housing on each side, and we're going to put a nut and a washer. And actually, lots of people don't put the washers back on. I think they lose them when they do the job. I always put them back on. I've got extras in case I lose one. But if Subaru wanted one on, if they didn't want one on there, they wouldn't have put one on there. So that's my opinion. We're going to start by putting the lower nut on the bell housing on this side. It's way down here. You got to stretch a little bit to get it in. You can't really see it, but you can feel it. You should be able to spin it on by hand. It's right down here. It's at the very bottom of the bell housing. There's a stud that takes a 10 by 825 millimeter nut. Of course, we put the washer on there, like I said, too. We're going to tighten it up. And we're going to put the other two bell bolts in too. Some of the earlier cars have a wire loom bracket that bolts up on either the top or the second bell housing bolt. Some of them use that, some don't. This particular one doesn't have a bracket. we got the bolts in. I'm just going to take my long swivel ratchet and tighten them up. You don't have to tighten them up too tight. They're probably, if I had to guess, probably about 30 foot-pounds. So that was quick and easy. We got those 4 done. We're going to go to the other side. Again, we're going to reach down and do the bottom bell. The nut that goes on the bottom, we put a washer on there, spun the nut on. Put the electric ratchet on there. Got it tightened up. We got one more bell housing bolt. That's right below the starter. It's right here. I don't know if hopefully you can see it. It's right next to the starter stud, the lower starter stud. So we're going to tighten that one up. It's easier to see with my ratchet on it because my ratchet's got a light that shows you where it is. Now we're going to snug those up too. There's 3 of them. That bottom nut's a little bit hard to get to, but I've always been able to get them in. So I'm actually going to let this car down because I still have it sitting up there and I'm having to struggle to reach everything. So next thing we're going to do is put the starter in it. So the starter also has a nut and a washer. And there's a long bolt with the battery ground bracket. That's what holds the starter on. You slide the starter in. Line up there's a stud that holds it on the bottom. When I say stud, I don't mean me, I mean there's a stud, a real stud. So we're going to put the nut and the washer on to hold it in place. That's I used a 14mm wrench. On the real early ones, that was a 17mm wrench to take that nut off, but they changed them in the later years. We're going to put this on. We're going to use the electric ratchet to make it go a little faster. I don't use my electric ratchet to tighten any bolts or loosen them. I just use it to spin them in. Hopefully it'll last longer if I do that. This battery bracket, I try to line this up so it's tilted a little bit towards the driver's side of the car. Sometimes it's hard to do that because it wants to spin. This one's being a little bit of a bugger, but we'll get her where we want it. Okay, we got that tight. We're going to tighten up the lower starter bolt, the starter nut. The swivel ratchet sure makes it easy to get at that stuff. You can see how easy it is when you have a swivel on there. So the starter's in there and tight. Now we're going to hook up the power wire to the starter. There's 2 of them. There's the signal wire and then there's a battery wire, and then we're going to hook up the ground strap to it. We've got the starter bolted in. Now we're just going to hook up the electrical to it. The hardware for that is a 8mm nut and a lock washer. That's for the starter, and then we have a short bolt with it's a flat washer and a lock washer built into it. That is the correct bolt for the ground strap. So the ground strap is right up on top, right here. Spin that on. We're just going to tighten that up. This goes to the battery. That's your battery ground strap. That is super important to have that back on there. I see these things hanging here. Cars come in without them. I don't know why people don't put them back on. And then this is the power wire. This is your battery wire that goes to the back of the starter. There's a lock washer and an 8mm nut that holds that on. We're just going to snug that up. Not too tight. Tight but not too tight. I'm going to put the rubber bellows over it, and then we're going to plug in the, this is the signal wire. This is when you turn the key. This is what tells the starter to spin. And that goes on the back of the solenoid. You'll find the flat spade that plugs into. It's got to feel around for it and plug it in. So the starter's all in. Next thing we're going to hook up is the dog bone on the back of the transmission bell housing. This is the dog bone right here. I've got it pulled up out of place, so I have to loosen the bolt on it just to get it to drop down. And we're going to put the nut in the washer, and there's a washer on both sides of this from the factory. It's a flat washer. The bolt goes through from the driver's side, and then there's a flat washer and a nut. Goes on there like that. We're going to tighten up the dog bone before we tighten up the bolt. That's snug. Now we're just going to tighten this up. Dog bone's in. The next thing we're going to put on it is the air cleaner bracket. The manuals are different than the automatics. This is an automatic bracket. The manuals, it's already fixed. It stays bolted to the side of the transmission. You can't remove it. On the automatics, you can remove it. You don't have to. I do to give me more room to get it to starter. It's only 2 bolts. It takes a minute. Just takes a minute to put it on. My little DeWalt 3/8 drive impact. We'll tighten them up to about 18 foot-pounds, and that's as tight as they got to be, right there. The next thing we're going to do is put the torque converter bolts in. So we're going to take the harmonic balancer bolt and screw it into the end of the crankshaft, so I can spin the engine over. So it turns in freely. Should go in real easy. And we're going to turn it clockwise. And we're going to take our finger and just line up one of the bolt holes in the torque converter to the flywheel. So that one's lined up already. So we're gonna just put a bolt in. We're not going to put it in all the way. We're just going to turn in real slow. We're going to put all 4 of them in before we tighten them. Otherwise, sometimes you get to the last one, it won't go in because there's just a little misalignment. So we're gonna put them all in just halfway. This is the last one, so I can tighten it. My impact gets them to about 18 foot-pounds. I would like to see these at about 25 foot-pounds, so I just put the ratchet on them and snug them up just a little bit more. Don't want to break them, so don't go too tight. And this is number 4 we're coming up on. Okay, those are all in. That's the inspection plug to access the bolts for the torque converter. A lot of times they're brittle and the little tabs break off that hold them in place. So I put a little silicone on them, just to silicone them, just to mount them in there so they don't fall off. So I'm going to grab some silicone. I use ultra gray on everything pretty much. It's equivalent to the OE silicone that Subaru uses. So you could put black on here so it matches the color of the plug, but I just use gray on everything. So I just put a bead around it, smaller than a pencil size bead, just like that, and then I just put it in place. There, snap it in place, and I just wipe off the extra silicone. So it looks pretty. And when the silicone dries, it'll be a nice watertight seal. Basically, it's there to access the torque converter bolts. It should be put back in there though, so nothing drops down in between the engine and the torque converter and the flywheel. If a bolt or something were to drop in there, it could make a mess out of the back of the bell housing or the bell housing face of the back of the engine. So I would definitely put that back on. I see lots of cars they're missing, but I put them back on. On the 2006 newer Forester and Outbacks, with this catalytic forward exhaust, they have 2 O2 sensors that are mounted in the catalytic converter, and there's a bracket that's on the bottom that mounts to the bottom of the head, and we're going to snap those in. I've already snapped the one in. There's a clip that holds them in place. I'm going to snap the other one in right next to it, and those just hold it out of the way, you know, for the fans or anything else hitting it. So those we're going to connect to the intake when it's time. This is the water crossover tube. It goes from one side of the block to the other, and it just equalizes the water from side to side. If you look at it, you can see that the surfaces are corroded where they bolted the block. See all the corrosion on there. I'm going to take them to the wire wheel and clean them up nice, because that's a definite potential place for a water leakage problem. So we're just going to take them to the wire wheel. You can actually see a little bit of pitting on here. The O-rings will seal over that, but I don't like that pitting, so I'm just going to put a really thin film of silicone on there to help it seal better before I bolt this down. And there's 2 O-rings that go into a groove on the block. These are Subaru O-rings. You can buy them elsewhere, but I use the OEM Subaru O-rings. They just seem to seal better. I don't know if it's the makeup of the rubber. I'll start on the right over here. Put the right one in, just set it down in place, and then the left one just sets right in there. Sets in a nice groove. Then we're just going to put a little bit of silicone on this water crossover. I typically only do this if there's pitting on the tube. Subaru didn't use sealant on these from the factory. but there wasn't pitting on this tube from the factory either. So I just do this because I don't want a water leakage issue under the intake manifold. So I've cleaned the bolts up, I've wire wheeled them, they were pretty ugly. You can see how nice they look now. The threads get pretty rusty, especially when these start to leak. And this crossover was definitely leaking. There was enough corrosion there that it was leaking. So we're gonna take this and set it right on top of the bosses. Line it up. And then we're going to put the 4 bolts in. And I'm just going to draw them down with this impact, and then tighten them up by hand. These bolts only get tightened to about 8 foot-pounds. They don't have to be super tight, but tight enough that they don't loosen up. We've got the water crossover tube in, and we're going to hook up the clamps to the heater core. They kind of fall into place. You know, there's 2 of them, and you can kind of tell just by laying them there which one goes to what side. They just kind of, you know, find their own way. I'm going to replace the spring clamps with the original style wire clamps that they used on the earlier style Subarus, just because I don't believe in those spring clamps. I don't think they do a real good job sealing. And these wire clamps that they used on Subarus, they used forever, and I've never seen one leak. So I just, and to buy good clamps these days, heater hose clamps, they're almost unavailable. Nobody makes good ones anymore. Everything that you buy in the aftermarket is made in China, and they just don't work well. So we're going to put both of these on. These are a little bit hard to get over the end of the hose. Slide that on. And then tighten that one up. Make sure the little washer is on here. If you're using these style clamps, there's a little washer at the very tip of the bolt. There's a tiny little washer there. Make sure that washer's on there. If it's not, it won't tighten up. I always put these opposing each other so you can get at them. If you put this on this side, you know, it kind of gets in the way. So I always put them opposite of each other. But I really like these clamps. Like I say, I've never had one leak. And I do not like the spring clamps that they put on these from the factory in the later years. Okay. We're pretty much ready to put the intake manifold on it. So I'm going to set this AC out of my way. I'm going to drop that down. I should be able to work around that. I'm going to lift this power steering up out of the way too. Kind of just hang it up there. I'm just making room so we can put the intake manifold on. Before I put the intake manifold on, I'm going to quickly install the harmonic balancer on the front of the engine. Before I put the balancer on, I always check on the front of the crankshaft to see where the keyway is. There's a groove on the inside of the balancer that lines up with the keyway on the crankshaft. You can just feel it with your finger. I can feel it. It's about 1 o'clock. So I likewise take the harmonic balancer and I aim it at about 1 o'clock. So when I drop the balancer down in place, I can pretty much just, wiggle it a little bit and get it to line up. And it just slides on. You'll know when it's on all the way because it's about 1/8 of an inch from the timing cover on the timing scale. So I've got that in. I'm going to go ahead and tighten it up now. Just going to spin the bolt in with my socket. This is a Company 23 tool. This holds the harmonic balancer from spinning while you're tightening on the end of the crankshaft. Company23.com. They sell lots and lots of Subaru specialty tools. It's a really great outfit. They sell all the tools for holding camshafts and a crankshaft tool that slides over the end of the crank so you can turn the crank over. They have a lot of really good specialty tools. It's a good place. It's a good place to buy tools. You can buy direct on their website. But this crankshaft tool, there's 4 holes in the front of the balancer that it slides into. You just slide it in, and then you just put your breaker bar on the end, and then just tighten it up. The balancer on this engine should be tightened to about 120 foot-pounds. Snug it up good with the breaker bar, and you're probably right around there. I could torque it down, but I do a lot of these. But if you want the torque spec, it's about 120 foot-pounds. There is an alternate way to hold the crankshaft from spinning if you don't have that tool, and I'm going to show you real quickly where that is. If you don't have a way to hold the crankshaft from spinning because it's an automatic car, there's no way to really hold it, you can just spin the crank with the breaker bar. There is an access hole on the side of the bell housing. I don't know if you can see it, Carrie. It's right here. It's right below the dowel pin that aligns the block. There's an access hole there. And what that access hole allows you to do is to take a screwdriver about this size, stick it in that hole, and you can take your breaker bar then, and you can turn your breaker bar, you can turn your crankshaft until you find a void in the flywheel to stick the screwdriver into. There's 4 voids in the flywheel. I'm just going to turn it over until I find one of the voids. There, the screwdriver will suddenly want to slide in as soon as you hit one of the voids. I'm going to show you what that void looks like on the flywheel. As you're turning the motor over, you're trying to find one of these 4 voids to stick the screwdriver through. When you stick that screwdriver through that hole, it'll ultimately go through this void in the flywheel, and you'll be able to lock the flywheel up so you can tighten that bolt up. You see where the screwdriver is, Carrie? Can you see that in there? If you watch now, I can actually tighten this bolt up and the motor doesn't spin over. And you can tighten it up as tight as you want then. So you don't actually have to have the tool to hold the balancer. There is an alternate way to hold the motor. So to get the screwdriver back out now, all you have to do is release the pressure by going backwards just a tad, and you can pull the screwdriver right back out. The screwdriver is actually going through the void like that, and then when you turn the flywheel, it locks it. That's what you're accomplishing by putting the screwdriver in there. So the flywheel won't turn over. We're going to set the intake gaskets on next and put the intake manifold on it. So there's 2 alignment pins on each side. You just make sure you have the gasket, facing the right direction. The injector indent is on the the valve cover side, and you just set those on the 2 alignment pins, and then the bolt holes will all line up. Do the same thing on the other side, and then we're ready to set the intake manifold on. I've already cleaned the intake manifold. I've taken I scraped the gasket surfaces and then took brake clean and cleaned the two gasket surfaces off. So the manifold's ready to set in place. I lightly set it up here. I've already moved the air conditioning compressor out of the way so I can hopefully get this set in place. And the first thing I have to do is align up the EGR tube on the intake manifold. That's the first thing you have to do when you set the intake down. One other thing I do is I try to get these spark plug wires kind of stuck out of the way so they don't fall. And this bracket kind of gets in the way too. So you kind of have to feed it in and move this bracket around as you're setting it in place. Okay. So I've kind of finagled it all in place. And like I said, the first thing you have to do, Carrie, if you want to get the camera back over here, we can get a good view of this EGR tube. Can you see the EGR tube right here, Carrie? It's this tube. This EGR tube has to go into the intake first. You have to feed that in. And you actually have to get it started. You have to turn it in at least 2 or 3 threads. You absolutely have to do that before you hook anything else up on this intake manifold. If you try to screw that in later, if the manifold is cocked a little bit, you can cross thread that EGR tube very easily. So that's the first thing you do. On this particular version of this engine, the next thing you have to do is you have to bolt up this bracket right here. This bracket right here, you have to put this bolt in. This very short 8mm bolt bolts this bracket in place. Oops, dropped it. Like I say, this bracket is for the 2 O2 sensors. So you have to get this bolt in and started, because once you have the intake bolted down, you cannot get that bolt in. So it's imperative that you do it at this point in the game. And it's kind of a bugger to get your finger in there and get it started while holding the intake up. It's just a really crappy place for them to put a bolt. Can you hold that right there? Thank you. That made all the difference in the world. Okay, so now that that bolt is in place, you can, if you take a look at it from this angle, Carrie, you can see that you can't put that bolt in once the intake is set down and bolted in place. There's no room to get that bolt in. So we've got the bolt in. I've tightened it with my finger. Now I'm going to tighten it up good before I put this intake down. So it's really a bugger to get at that bolt. So you're better off just to get it tight now while you're at it. Doesn't have to be super tight. It's just holding a bracket in place, but we got it tight, and we're going to move on. What we're going to do next is we're going to tighten up that EGR tube on the back side of the intake. I'm going to grab a wrench here. And it's a 7/8 open-end wrench. And we're going to tighten up this EGR tube on the back side of the intake. And then after that, we're just going to start hooking up all the, we're going to get the bolts all started and hook up all the hoses and wires. We're just going to get this tight first. Just good and snug. It's screwing into aluminum. You don't want to strip anything. So we're going to be putting the 8 intake bolts in. Make sure you have all 8 in your hand. If you can't find one of the intake bolts, you need to find it, because the scariest thing that I've ever heard happening is when somebody sets an intake manifold down on the engine, one of the intake bolts is still in the intake, and it pops out and goes down the intake valve. You want to make sure that you have all 8 intake valve bolts in your hand when you start this procedure. You don't want to end up with one in the intake port. It'll get stuck in the valve and you'll be doing this whole thing over again. So we're going to put the first one in the front first. So that's easy to get to. We're going to go to the other side and do the front one also. So we're going to get the intake manifold lined up. Okay, so we got the 2 front ones in. Now we're going to fish the rest of them in. They're fairly easy to get to. Not necessarily easy to get a bolt down in there. So what I'll do is I'll take a needle nose pliers. Just stick the bolt into the end of a needle nose like this, and I'll just go and drop it down into place. It's kind of hard to see down in there. I don't know if the camera will show us, but it's right smack in the middle of the intake. And so I've got the 2 bolts dropped down in there, and now I'm going to just take my extension with the socket and spin them in by hand. I'm going to make sure I have all 8 of them in before I tighten anything. So I'm going to put the back one in. We go back to this side and start tightening them up. Starting in the middle. I'm guessing right around 18 to 20 foot-pounds would be perfect. But I've done this so many times, I know about how tight they should be by memory. Get those 4 tight. Tighten these 4 now. Okay. And to double check all 8 of them. I've had cars come in where only 4 of them were tight. somebody lost track of what they were doing and didn't get all 8 of them tightened up, and big intake leak. So all 8 of those are in. Each side of the engine has a breather hose. I put the breather hoses on before I put the spark plug wires on. It's just easier to get the breather hose in place. So it just snaps in the very top of the center of the valve cover. It just snaps down on, and there's a clamp that holds it in place. And that's just a breather that goes to the air cleaner. And then from then I snap the spark plug wires on. Make sure they snap in, make sure you can hear them snap. And then in this particular version, they have a ground strap on each side. Plug that in at this time. And then you've got some wiring on the front of this engine. You've got a camshaft sensor wire, which plugs in right here. Can you see that, Carrie? Camshaft. Here it snaps in. Mm-hmm. And then you have the oil pressure sensor for the variable cam timing, which is the gray plug. I'm sorry. It's a white plug. Sensor is gray. And then the blue plug is the solenoid. Make sure you got all those plugged in. While we're on this side of the engine, I'm going to hook up the water hose to the throttle body. It's on the very top. And then there's a vacuum hose for the power brake booster, and we're going to snap that in place. Next thing we have are the 2 fuel lines. The bottom one is a breather line, and that just has a clamp on it. Just gonna put that little clamp back in place. And then the upper one snaps on. There is a spring inside there. Releasing these can be a little bit of a bugger because of this expansion on the flange. There's a special tool for it. Makes it much easier. Actually, the plastic ones I have that I've used I buy at Harbor Freight for $5, and they work fine. But this just snaps. That just snaps back on. So the only thing left on this side of the engine is the knock sensor, and you're not going to probably be able to see that very well, Carrie, because I can't even see it. It's on the very top of the bell housing on the driver's side, and it's a plug that's kind of a bugger to get to, and you can really only feel your way around it. It's really hard to see, and a lot of people forget to plug it in. I'm going to grab my flashlight. Maybe you can see it once I put some light on it. It's a gray harness plug and a black sensor. You want to try and see if you can scooch that back here and see that, Carrie? Can you see it right here? This plug?
Yeah, okay, I see the plug.
See the gray plug and the black sensor? A lot of people forget to plug that in when they're doing the install, and you'll get a code for that. So I'm going to finagle it in if I can get it plugged in. Sometimes they're a bugger. Yep. Can you hold that? Shine it on there. Okay, it's snapped in. We're good there. Okay. So we have all the connections done on this side of the engine. Now we're going to move to that side. So again, you have a breather, this breather hose that goes to the air cleaner box. It's got a little clamp on it. We're just going to snap that in place. Clamp it down. Sometimes they're really hard to get on and off. This one isn't too bad. And then we're going to pop our spark plug wires in place. Sometimes those aren't the easiest to get them to snap in. That one I felt. This one snapped in, but it didn't make a noise. So now we're gonna plug in our two oxygen sensor wires up front here. They're black on black and gray on gray, so it's easy to know where they go. Sometimes you have to push the detent down in order to get them to snap in. This one's being a bugger because I'm not pushing on the detent. Detent's back here. There, detent's right here. Push on that and push it in. And this one, detent's right here, snaps in. So we got the O2 sensors hooked in. Now we have some more wires back here. So we have we have a PCV hose that plugs in right up here. Comes off the very top of the block in the back. There's a Y back there, and this goes to the air cleaner. We have three connections up front. This is the coolant sensor wire. You snap that in. This is the crankshaft position sensor wire. Snap that in. And then we have the oil pressure sending unit. That's all snapped in. This one will go to the power steering once we set it in place. We're going to do that after we get everything else hooked up here. So we're going to go to the back of the engine now, and there's another coolant line that goes to the throttle body. There's an in and an out, and we're going to hook that up first so we don't forget that. So I just plug that in, and then I'm going to put the clamp in place. So now we've got both the coolant hoses hooked up to the throttle body. The next thing we're going to do is hook up this bracket. Actually, before the bracket, we're going to plug these. There's three wires on the back of this cylinder head here. If you want to try and reposition a little bit better, there's three wires that we're going to hook up before we put this bracket in place, because the bracket kind of gets in the way. So there's an oil temperature sending unit we're going to snap in. That one's in place. This is the oil pressure switch for the variable cam timing, snapped in place, and this is the solenoid for the variable cam timing, snapped in place. So we have all three of those connections made. Those are the only three on the back side except for this ground strap. There's a ground strap just like on the other side of the engine, and we're going to plug that in. They didn't have these until the later model years. The ground straps that go to the fire, to the strut tower. So we've got that plugged in. So now what we have is the main connector for the ECU wiring harness. But there's two bolts that hold this bracket in place. And I've got those two bolts right here. One of them is a 10 millimeter by about a 3/4 inch in length, and one of them is an 8 millimeter about the same length. Both of these bolts hold this bracket in place. So one is on the side of the block. Carrie, do you remember when I showed you that screwdriver trick where you stick the screwdriver through the flywheel? That same bolt hole holds this bracket in place. So it's right below the dowel pin on the side of the engine block, and there's a bolt that goes through there. And we're going to put that bolt in place first. I'm going to screw it in with my finger. And I've got it started. Kind of hard to see, but it's right on the side of the block. So I've got that one in almost all the way, and I'm going to put this bolt in on the top. And that one's started. I'm going to get a wrench and tighten both of those up. I'm going to tighten up the top one first. Now I'm going to grab a ratcheting box end to do the other one. Like I say, you can't really see this one. It's kind of hard to see, but you got to put it back in. I'm going to tighten that one up. It's right on the side of the block. Kind of hard to see down there. It's tight. So we're going to connect the main ECU wiring harness next. There's a bracket right here, a wire loom bracket that we're going to have to release in order to get this in place. I'm going to grab a screwdriver. We have to release this little bracket. There's a little slot on the bottom side of the outside of this loom that you have to stick a screwdriver in to release this wire loom. Just got to come in from the bottom side on the outside right here and release it. There's a little slot. So we're going to stick this in the wire loom. You have to have this back. It has to slide into the groove. So there. Once you get it in and pull this back, it'll snap in. Kind of a bugger, but you'll get it. And this just snaps down in place and holds that in. So, first of all, we're going to bolt the air conditioning compressor in place. There's 4 bolts for that. I knew I put one in here. So these are the 4 bolts for the AC. They're all the same. I've already wire wheeled them, taken all the thread lock out of them and cleaned them up good. And they just go in. They just hold this AC bracket in place. One more over here. That one we're going to do with a ratchet because it's hard to get to. And this back one is kind of hard to get to too. We're going to do that with a ratchet. We're going to kind of draw it back with this one. I always put this one in first because this one has to pull the AC compressor back. If you put these in first and tighten them, then you could be tightening against the other bolts. So I just snug that one up, and then the other ones should just go right in. Get them all 4 started. Snug them all up with the longer ratchet. Probably 30 foot-pounds is plenty. Don't have to be too tight. Okay. Just gonna continue on with this power steering pump now. Set it down in place. Sets up on the motor. We're going to snap this reservoir into its bracket. You want to bring that over here? It just snaps down in. This little finger holds it in place. Then you've got 2 bolts here that we need to put in, and 3 bolts on the power steering pump and a plug. Let me grab some bolts. So the 3 bolts that hold that power steering pump on there's one long one and 2 short ones. They're both all 8mm. 8mm bolt, 12mm head. I always put the longer one in first, and the longer one goes right here. You want to come on to the right side of me, Carrie? It's on the bottom. It's above the harmonic balancer to the left side if you're standing in front of the car. I always put the long one in first, get it started. If you clean the threads on the bolts, they go in much easier. Then there's one directly below the pulley. And you should be able to screw them in by hand. Okay, those 2 are started, and then there's one right back here underneath the wiring harness right here. It's kind of hard to see. Can you see that? Mm-hmm. Yep. That one we're going to get with a little bit longer extension. Before I tighten the back one up, I always tighten the 2 front ones. So I'm going to go back to the 2 front and snug them up, because you're actually pulling the power steering pump backwards as you tighten the front ones up. So I just snug them up good. Like I say, one's right here and the other one's almost dead center of the pulley, just right below the pulley. Got that one tight. We're going to go back and tighten the top one now. We're just going to snug it up. We're not going to strip them. And then we have the electrical plug that we talked about earlier, and that just plugs in right here with the release upward. The release faces up. We're just going to snap it in. So the only thing we have left are the 2 bolts for the power steering line bracket. Let me grab those bolts. And those 2 bolts, they just go straight down in. They're just short little bolts. They kind of have a little nipple on the end to help them start. They're not very big bolts, so they don't have to be real tight. Just snug them up. So power steering's all in. We're going to put the air conditioning belt on next. Got 2 belts. Air conditioning belt is the narrow of the 2. They're almost the same length belt. The air conditioning belt's just a tad bit longer. So we're going to take the narrow belt and we're going to slide it over the air conditioning. Always face the letters outward so you can read them. That's just an anal thing I do. You don't have to do it that way, but I always like them facing forward. And now we're going to put the tensioner bracket on it. Check the pulley, make sure the pulley spins freely. You can replace just the plastic pulley if it's bad. But this one seems fine, so we're going to put that in place. And there's 2 bolts. They're long bolts. I mean, it seems strange that they use such a long bolt, but they do, and they're all the same. Every year use the same bolt. We're just going to screw those in. And we're going to use the electric ratchet again. Grab my regular ratchet and we're going to snug those up, trying not to break them. And then we're going to make sure that the belt is lined up with the pulley. Can you see the pulley there, Carrie? Right here? Mm-hmm. Okay, now we're going to tension the belt. We're going to just, that goes clockwise, and we're just going to take it down until we got a good tension on the belt. And we're going to snug up the nut on the front side. If you do not tighten this nut up, that pulley will eventually loosen up to the point where it'll wear a hole in your timing cover. This nut has to be tight. Don't forget to tighten this nut up. It's a lock nut for the pulley. And if you don't tighten it, that belt won't ride straight and it'll wear the pulley right through the timing cover. Seen it many, many times. More times than I can count. So now we're gonna put the radiator in it next. Sometimes the accessories will conflict a little bit with the fans, so we're going to set the radiator down in place. This particular model year has a heat shield in front of the transmission lines, making those transmission lines a little bit hard to get to. So on this version, I pull the whole thing out as an assembly, with the fans and the transmission lines and everything already on there. So that's how I pull it out, and that's how I set it right back in place. And I disconnect the transmission lines on the side of the fender well. So we're going to set this in as a whole assembly. Hoping we can get it past the power steering and the radiator hose. So I've got the bushings lined up that hold it in place on the bottom, and now there's a little holder clamp for the power steering line. Can you see that, Carrie? I snap that in place. Just snaps right in there. Just a little bracket for the power steering line. Okay. So I've got that sitting in place. I'm going to bolt that radiator in place now. The two brackets are the same for this application. They use the same one left and right. There's just two short bolts, 8mm bolts that hold that in. It's in. Now we've got two electrical connections that we need to make. There are two plugs for the fans. Can you see that, Carrie, right down there? Does the light help a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, so that you just have to push in and snap in. Sometimes you got to push on the detent to get it to snap in. There's one there, and then there's one on the bottom of the radiator over here. Now this one might be a little harder to see. Can you see down? Maybe from this angle. Can you see that right there?
That's all right. Go ahead.
This one's a bugger to get to. I got it plugged in. So we got the two fans plugged in. Now we have the two transmission lines that we have to hook back up, plug into the fender well here. Can you see these down there, Carrie? You can see them now.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're plugging them both in. They kind of fall into place. They find their own little spot where they go, and you just push them in, and we're going to tighten them up with a little nut wrench. They're 1/4 inch. These clamps are 1/4 inch. So we're gonna just snug them up. Okay, we're gonna use the electric. It's kind of hard to swing a ratchet in there, so we're gonna use the electric wrench again. And we're just gonna snug them up. We're not gonna go crazy tight on them. Okay. Yeah, they're tight. Don't need to go any tighter than that. So we've got the tranny lines hooked up now. We're going to leave the, we're going to hook up the, make sure this is hooked up to the return, tank return. We're going to put the return, the catch can for the radiator on there now. Just it's a little self-aligning pin on the bottom of it that goes onto the radiator shroud. And you just kind of set it in place. It kind of finds its own place. And then 2 bolts hold it in place. Don't have to be real tight, it's just plastic. The tube back in place. I'm going to go underneath the car, put the lower radiator hose on it. It's kind of hard to see down there, so we're just going to assume that you're capable of putting a lower radiator hose on yourself. Okay, we're going to do the alternator. I'm going to give you a little hint on this because sometimes these are a bugger. There's a sleeve in the alternator right here. Sometimes it's hard to get the alternator to drop into this bracket right here. So I've already pounded this sleeve back, but in order to do that, you would take a large socket and a hammer, set that on the ground, set the alternator there, and take a hammer and tap that sleeve in. You're actually see the sleeve sticking out the other side now? That's what you want. That's what you want to do. So then when you set this alternator in, it just slides right in place. You don't have to fight with it to get it in. And there's this, it's a self-holding nut that goes on the back side. Just fighting with Daddy a little bit. Okay, we're going to put the belt on before we put the other bolt in the front of the alternator. Okay, we've got that lined up. All the grooves are in the pulleys, and we're going to lift this up and start the bolt in the front of the alternator. Okay, so I've got it in as far as it'll go by hand. Now we're going to take the impact and we're just going to snug up the belt. It's plenty tight. Don't forget to tighten this bolt either. It will work its way out. This bolt doesn't get tightened up. That holds the shroud in place. That goes on last. So this bolt that we don't tighten up quite yet. We're going to hook the wiring up to it now. Just kind of slides through here. AC. The AC signal wire plugs in. There's a bracket on the oil filler tube that snaps in. And I see that there's a part missing here. There's supposed to be a little shroud over this alternator connector. This car actually came with a plastic cover that would snap open, but it's missing, it's gone, and I don't have one. I've got the old style, which you know, worked for many, many, many years for Subaru. So I'm going to put that old style one on here, and it does the same thing. It protects it from being grounded. All I'm trying to do is protect that positive battery cable. We're just going to snug up this positive cable. Just snugged it up and put the cover over it. This is a protected from somebody grounding, you know, putting a wrench against it and shooting sparks everywhere. And then we have the signal wire that plugs in. So those are the only two connections on the alternator, and that just snaps down in place. It'll snap too when you push on it. So the alternator is all hooked up. Everything's on there. This is the belt cover for the alternator belt, and that goes behind this bolt that we had previously put in. There's a big flat washer that it sits behind, and then there's a shouldered bolt that looks like that goes through this rubber grommet and snugs up. And a lot of people over tighten this bolt. It's a shoulder bolt. It only has to be so tight. I mean, it just has to be snugged up enough that it doesn't come loose. And then this bolt can be tightened up. Once that bolt's in and tight, we can tighten this bolt up. And that sleeve that we drove out, you're now pulling it back in, so it takes a little bit to snug it up. You don't have to over tighten that either. Now we're going to put the AC belt cover on. Just slides over the stud right here. And then there's a bolt right here. So we're going to put a little self-locking nut on there. And then the bolt right here. We'll tighten those up. And you're just tightening against plastic here, so it doesn't have to be that tight. If you over tighten these, you're just going to break the plastic. They just have to be snug. This is a self-locking nut, so it turns a little bit harder. Just snug them up. So I'm going to get the air cleaner set up. Here's the air box. We're going to set that in place. Just going to look back here, make sure everything else looks good. Looks like we got everything done. Oh, we got one other thing. I forgot. There's a bracket that supports this air box that mounts right here. So we're going to put that in quick. It actually supports the air box at this point, so we're going to put that in. And that just goes in a hole right here. Okay. So now we're going to set the air box in place. Make sure you pull it snugly against the throttle body intake, and then now we're going to tighten up the clamp. There's just a hose clamp right there. We're going to snug that up. Everybody tightens these things up so tight they strip them out. They don't have to be that tight. It's rubber. It tightens up pretty easy. And then we have two bolts that hold the air cleaner box right here. Oops. Oh, somebody probably stripped. Let's try this one. That one went in the good way. Yeah, oh, this one's all stripped. Let me get a different one. Looks like it's somebody's been into it. Oh, got it, got it, got it. And on this one, there's a little flow sensor that has to be plugged in. It's kind of a little tricky little deal. You have to plug the plug plugs into the flow sensor, and then it snaps into the air box. There's a little catch on this air box, and this just snaps in, and it's tight. These are a little tricky to take apart. Lots of people break this trying to get it apart. You have a nice clean air filter. Got that set in place, and we're gonna put the air cleaner in. Excuse me. Snap that in. We're gonna route the mass airflow wire underneath and snap that in. Don't forget to put that on there so you won't run too good. There's two breather hoses that have to be hooked up to the air box also, and there's one on each side. They go to the valve cover. Make sure you get those. Make sure you get those plugged in, because sometimes people forget to put those on. Yeah, it's easy to miss. Just gotta slide them in place. I'm gonna put the battery in now. I don't know if this battery's any good. I charged it. Seems to be okay. Came with the car. We're gonna find out. It's gonna be Judgment Day on the battery. Just set it in place and put the battery hold down in place, and we're gonna feed the two tie downs. It's kind of a bugger to get these lined out sometimes. Let's see how. That one went right in. They're a little bit easier since they move the windshield washer bottle out of the way. It's a little bit easier to put the battery in these cars. I've got both hold downs in. I'm just going to snug them up a little bit, not too tight. If you over tighten those, you will tear the sheet metal down below the battery that holds them in place. If you over tighten these, you will make this battery hold down almost inoperable. So don't over tighten these two bolts. They just have to be snug. Hook up the positive side of the battery cable. Just snug. Okay, battery's in place. It's time to put the fluids in it. We're going to put oil and antifreeze in it. My preferred oil, Castrol GTX 10W30. That's what I run in all my vehicles. I do my oil changes every 3,500 miles, and I've never had a Subaru that used any oil that I ran Castrol GTX in. Now, everybody's got their preference for oil. Lots of people like synthetic oils, but I know lots of Subarus that don't. You can put synthetic oil in a lot of Subarus, and it will consume a lot of oil. So I've just come to rely on Castrol GTX. I use it in my pickup truck. I use it in all my Subarus. I have several turbo cars. I have a Saab 9.3 turbo car with a V6 twin scroll turbo. I run Castrol GTX in it. The oil cap says 530. 530 is a general oil viscosity for all applications. No matter whether you live in Alaska, Hawaii, Arizona, Michigan, Minnesota. If you're living in a high temperature climate like Arizona, 10W30 oil is what you should be using. 5W30 is just too light of a viscosity to oil for 115 degree temperatures. So that's just an FYI. If you're living in a cold climate, even during the winter in Wisconsin or Minnesota or New York, or if you live in Buffalo, 530 is probably fine in the winter. But during the summer, you really should be using 10W30 oil. It's just a general viscosity that they use for all climates. So that's just, and I have found that the engines live longer when you put a little bit heavier oil in them. When I put the coolant in it, I always fill at the upper radiator hose. And I always put a full gallon of full strength, extended life antifreeze into the engine.
You don't have to mix antifreeze anymore?
The engine mixes it. We're gonna put a gallon of water in, almost a gallon of water in it too. But we're gonna put the antifreeze in first. So I got a gallon of antifreeze in there. I'm gonna go fill this up with water. Now we're just adding straight water to it. We're just going to we're going to put as much in the engine as it'll take. And the reason we do that is when we start the engine's already full of water. It doesn't have to draw it from the radiator. So the water pump will be running, it'll be spinning with antifreeze in it. So you're not running the water pump dry. So we're just going to keep adding till it won't take anymore, and then we're going to fill a radiator.
You're supposed to use distilled water?
Some say you should use distilled water. I don't have any. So I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. Somebody's gonna write a comment about it on my in the comment section of this YouTube video anyway. They're going to say, you should use distilled water. Check both clamps, make sure they're nice and tight. Oh, this is just the little air intake piece that snaps onto goes on into the fender well. Just snaps in there, bolts on right here. Now I'm just going to top the radiator off. And I'm going to put some in the coolant recovery tank. I don't have a whole lot left here. We'll top off the recovery tank after it reaches operating temperature. So we're going to fire it up now. Let's see if she fires. Got the oil topped off. Antifreeze is full. I double checked everything. Looks like I've got everything connected, plugged in. So what we're going to do is we're going to cycle the key on and off 3 times before we actually hit the starter to get the fuel pump an opportunity to fill up all the fuel system. Okay, we're going to let it cycle 3 times. Fired right up. Sounds good too. No check engine lights. The oil light went right out. Everything sounds good so far. I'm just gonna let it idle for 15 minutes and let everything, let the computer go through its relearning process. So we're gonna let it sit here with the air conditioning off for 15 minutes, and then we're gonna turn the air conditioning on, and then let it run for a few minutes with the AC on. It has to relearn the AC parameters too. So we're just gonna let it run for a few minutes. We're gonna keep an eye on all the levels and double check for oil leaks. So. Sounds good. Nice and quiet. We've let it run for 15 minutes. Everything looks good. No leaks. Engine sounds great. Power steering was making a little bit of whining. It seems to have quieted down. May have to change an O-ring on the power steering pump. Sometimes they'll suck air at the O-ring where the return line connects to the power steering pump. But it's quieted down. It sounds pretty good now. I'm going to turn the AC on and let it run for just a couple of minutes with the AC on before we take it for a ride. Seatbelts. Seatbelts for safety. So this is the maiden voyage. I've never driven this car. I just bought it, put a new engine in it.
Oh, this is your car?
Yeah, I bought this car with a blown up engine. It was completely seized. The engine was seized up tight.
Did you rebuild the engine that was in it, or is the seized engine junk?
The short block is junk. I've taken the other engine apart, and the heads are good, and you know, some of the parts are good. You can reuse some of the parts, but the engine, the crank, or the block, and the crank, and the pistons, and that's all garbage. It's just wiped out. She drives nice. Very happy with this car. It's got some pep too. No check engine lights. Everything looks good so far.
I think you've done this before.
Oh, once or twice. Got a little rattle in the dash, so I'm not going to dig. Gonna have to drive on just really smooth roads until I fix that. Temperature came up real nice. I even got it with a full tank of gas.
How many miles are on this car?
150,000.
Do you know if it's its first motor?
I checked the VIN number, and yes, it's the motor. The engine that was in it was the original engine.
What'd you say?
Pretty damn sure it's the original engine. So got 150,000 on the first one. This one's good for another 150.
So this is your car for now, huh?
I'm gonna use it for a daily driver.
Until someone makes you an offer?
Until somebody offers me more than I can refuse.
How much would that be?
About $6,000. If somebody offered me $6,000 for it, I'd sell it.
Awesome.
Somebody will eventually offer me $6,000. It's a nice car. Leather interior, big sunroof, clean, very nice car.
2006?
2006.
Brand new motor?
Brand new motor. That's what makes it.
AC works?
AC works great. What makes this car appealing now to a lot of people is the fact that it has a brand new engine in it. And it's got a mic motor in it, so it's going to last for a long time.
A mic motor.
A mic motor.
And this is all-wheel drive, isn't it?
All-wheel drive.
So good in the snow and the rain.
Oh yeah, and it's got real nice all-season tires on it. They're literally almost brand new. So this will be a nice. This would be a nice car for somebody else, but it's going to be a nice car for me for now. So that wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope it's helpful to you guys that are trying to get this stuff done for the first time. So we'll see you next time.